Welcome back to the London Futurist podcast. Our guest today is Pedro Domingos, who is joining an elite group of repeat guests. He joined us before in episode 34 in April 2023. Pedro is Professor Emeritus of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of Washington. He's done pioneering work in machine learning, like the development of Markov logic networks, which combine probabilistic reasoning with first-order logic. He's probably best known for his book, The Master Algorithm, which describes 5 different tribes of AI researchers and argues that progress towards human-level general intelligence requires a unification of their approaches. And I can say from personal experience, it's extremely helpful if you want to understand how machine learning works. More recently, Pedro has become a trenchant critic of what he sees as exaggerated claims about the power and potential of today's AI, and of calls to impose constraints on it. He's just published 2040, A Silicon Valley Satire, a novel which ridicules big tech and also American politics. Pedro, welcome back to the London Futurist podcast.
Thanks for having me back.
It's good to talk with you again, Pedro.
Let's start with your new book. David and I have both read it, and we agree it's very good fun. You say that it was inspired by a journalist asking you whether you would vote for an AI president, and you said no, unless the other candidate was Donald Trump. And you've expressed the hope that it will do for big tech what Tom Wolfe's Bonfire of the Vanities did for Wall Street in the 1980s. So how would you summarize the book and your reasons for writing it?
The book, in one sentence, is ChatGPT runs for president. And as you can imagine, the gags just start flowing. As soon as I had that idea, and it was a journalist's fault, the novel just grew like a kudzu vine. I couldn't stop writing it because there's just so much to satirize in the tech industry, in the hype and fear around AI, in the current state of American politics and American culture. It's just this irresistible stew. But the idea of writing a novel about Silicon Valley actually predated this. And as you say, the inspiration was the Bonfire of the Vanities. My experience with talking with people of all different kinds, journalists, politicians, entrepreneurs, etc., about AI and explaining things is that at the end of the day, nothing communicates things better than a well-told story. I can write 100 pages of very carefully crafted nonfiction that really set things out the way I think they are. But what's really compelling is when people see a story that illustrates the point. And in particular, when it comes to AI and what the real versus fake dangers of AI are, I think people have been unduly influenced by the Hollywood version of AI, by Terminator. In fact, at one point, I complained to Ron Howard, famous film director who's directed a lot of great sci-fi movies. Why is it that Hollywood is always portraying AI as the bad guy, some evil big thing taking over, exterminating us? And he shrugged and said, well, that's the easy way to tell a story. And if you want something else, write it. And I was like, fair point. So here it is. It's called 2040, and it's my version of hopefully an entertaining and fun AI novel where AI, as opposed to being what Hollywood paints, is AI as it really is. AI with bugs, AI that's imperfect, that's a work in progress, that's mainly driven by the humans and their foibles. The things that go wrong at the end of the day here is not some evil, even person, let alone AI taking over. It's just the interaction of different people's motivations and how they turn out badly, as they do in real life.
And is anybody from Hollywood going to make a movie of it?
Not that I know of so far, but honestly, a number of people at this point have told me this should be a movie because some novels are more cinematic than others. And this novel, I would say, is very cinematic, not even by design, but because I'm a big movie buff. There are a lot of things in the plot, in the characters, in the gags and situations that are movie references, one after another. Network, Jaws, A Few Good Men, etc., etc. Again, this part is by design. The plot is a little bit like a Hollywood thriller. There's a big fight and suspense and things that go wrong, and there's a cliffhanger and who's going to win the elections. So I'm very biased, but yes, I think someone should make a movie out of this.
So some films portray AI as the bad guy in terms of Terminator. Some films or discussions portray social media as the real trouble in our time. You've got a social media in your book. I think it's called HappyNet. Is that one of the bad guys, the good guys, or just a complicated mixture?
Great question. HappyNet is very much a complicated mixture. And you're right that maybe less so in Hollywood, but often social media is portrayed as the bad guy of our times. I think this portrayal is exaggerated. It's not entirely false. But again, I think the focus should be on not either social media is fine or we need to stop it, we need to ban social media, etc., but on making it work better. And in fact, the novel illustrates this. The first version of Prezibot 1.0, is ChatGPT. But then after a bunch of things, the second version, Prezibot 2.0, is actually, in a way, social media with AI on top of it.
Yeah, it's a sort of crowdsourcing system, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It's crowdsourcing. The first Prezibot is an it. The second Prezibot, it's we. It's us. And this is how I want people to see AI and social media. Social media, my frustration is with the algorithm by which it processes what we produce. Look at Twitter. If Twitter was really good at selecting and synthesizing and chaining the things that it receives to serve each one of us, it would be amazing. The problem is that it's not. So we need to make that happen. This is my message to Elon Musk, and I think he's receptive. It's like, we need to turn this whole thing into something of another level. HappyNet, the quote-unquote big evil tech company in 2040, it's actually more than social media. It's the thing that every American, actually, maybe not just every American, but certainly in America, tech billionaire wants to have, which is the everything app. And in China already exists
With WeChat.
with WeChat. It's like one app that does everything. But in America, this is very hard to do because each one of them already owns a piece of the puzzle and it's hard for them to come together. But the business model of HappyNet is based on the 7 deadly sins. It actually has a division for each of the sins. So greed is all the apps catering to finance. Lust is all the apps for dating. Pride, etc., etc. And in a way, this is illustrating something real. The character of Mark Newell, who's the CEO and founder of this company, again, like everything in this novel is there to illustrate a real point, but he really is, to your point of whether it's good or evil, he's well-intentioned. Just like the Mark Zuckerbergs and whatnot of this world. He really thinks HappyNet makes the world a better place by letting people come together and blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, he kind of overlooks the fact that really what he's doing is making money with it. And when push comes to shove, he actually chooses the stuff that makes them more money as opposed to the stuff that's more benign. Now, the bigger point in all of this, which again, to me is a very important one, isn't even all of this, is that he's overconfident in his ability to understand and manipulate the vast streams of society. And without any spoilers, this is what then goes very badly. And this, I think, is a real danger with social media. And also, there's things we can do about it.
I saw an interesting post, I think it was probably on Twitter, about how the 7 deadly sins are well represented by different social media. And as you say, in America, they're all diverse, whereas in China, it's all in WeChat. I'll forget many of them, but pride was Instagram, greed was LinkedIn, wrath was Twitter, sloth was Netflix. I've forgotten what lust was, and I think I probably left off a couple. But yes, it will probably be a bad day if anybody ever managed to gather all those up into one big platform. I wanted to ask you, which director would you like to direct your movie?
That's a good question. It depends on what kind of movie it would be. There's an obvious one, actually. There's a really obvious director for this movie, and that's Mike Judge. Mike Judge is the creator of Silicon Valley, the TV show. I did a bunch of research before writing the book, and I couldn't find any good novel satires of Silicon Valley. There have been a few attempts, but honestly, not very successful, in my opinion, and too few. But Silicon Valley, the TV show, is actually a really good spoof of Silicon Valley.
And well liked in Silicon Valley is what I can make out.
Yeah, because, and again, I really tried to do this in 2040. It works for the general public, but it also works for the insiders, because there's a whole series of inside jokes where you know exactly what it is that they're satirizing. The people, the products, or whatever. And again, 24 is like that as well. And Mike Judge could do this because before getting into the entertainment business, he actually worked in Silicon Valley. He is also the director of the movie Idiocracy. I don't know if you've seen this movie, but there's something of that in Our Times and Getting Worse. And of course, there's also something of that in 2040. I haven't met him, but I think he has the kind of humor and the kind of understanding that would make for a good movie. But just to give a counterpoint to that, if you really ask me what would be the dream director for this movie, I would say it's Martin Scorsese.
Ah, right.
So I'm a big fan of Martin Scorsese to begin with. What he does in all his movies in an absolutely brilliant way, he's like, they're all very over the top. He says that himself. It's like, I take everything and I jack it up to 11, which is what makes them so good. If you look, for example, at The Wolf of Wall Street, it's a satire of the world of finance, but it's a satire of a very high caliber. The sheer level of craziness piling on craziness. Part of 2040 is literally inspired by the movie After Hours. There's all these misadventures that happen to this guy and what he learns running around in the middle of New York in the middle of the night. And this happens to Ethan, the protagonist of 2040. And then he discovers the real world of San Francisco, the vast underground data center that it's actually full of homeless people squatting, etc., etc. So I think if Martin Scorsese wanted to turn this into a movie, he would probably do the most amazing job.
I went through a similar evolution of thinking as you. When I first got into this futurist lark, I thought we needed stories to wake more people up to the possible futures of AI, both good and bad. So I wrote a novel called Pandora's Brain with the hope that somebody would pick it up and turn it into a movie. And the person I wanted to, initially it was Ridley Scott, because I just love pretty much all of his movies. But then Christopher Nolan, after Dark Knight, I thought was perhaps the most talented director around. And I was horrified when, just before I published Pandora's Brain, I started to see stories about a movie called Transcendence coming out, which had a very similar plot at the beginning. They're very different stories overall. And Transcendence was being made by Christopher Nolan's cameraman, Wally Pfister. So I thought, oh, maybe that's a good thing. I've been preempted. It doesn't really matter who produces the thing as long as it's good and it wakes people up. But Transcendence, despite the fact I think it's actually a pretty good movie, it bombed terribly. Johnny Depp does a sort of okay job, but it kind of feels like he's phoning it in some of the time. But nevertheless, he's a very charismatic actor and it works okay, and other people carry it. I think it's actually a pretty good movie, but it didn't do the job because nobody watched it.
So my preoccupation in writing this book was, actually, let me preface that with the following. The book just arose. I didn't decide to write it, it wrote itself. That is the high order bit, as we like to say in computer science. Having said that, your brain always has a rational side that says, well, if I'm going to do this, I should do it properly, because why not? As you say, if nobody reads the book, then what was the point? And so as much as I was trying to convey these real things that I think would be good for people to know about AI, I was also concerned with writing a very exciting, unputdownable romp. And I saw this masterclass by Dan Brown, for example, about how he writes thrillers. He really knows how to write thrillers, whether you like them or not. You can say they're schlocky, but he's a master of that art. And I just applied a lot of that in 2040. My rule was that every single thing, every paragraph in the novel has to do four things. It has to advance the plot, meaning it's a sequence of random events that is actually carefully crafted by me. Actually, I learned from P.G. Wodehouse how to write satires. I went and looked at that. He's maybe the greatest satirist or one of the greatest satirists of all time. And he said this thing which really resonated with me, which is a satire, all these comical things, it's a very fine piece of clockwork. They won't happen randomly. So my golden rule was everything in the novel has to A, advance the plot, B, reveal the characters. This is just standard good writing. But then also be entertaining and illustrate a larger point. Right? A lot of authors fall into the other side, which is all you're doing is entertaining people. There's nothing wrong with that. But this is as a means to, if you're absorbed and you read it and you tell other people that you liked it, then it does its job of letting people know more about AI.
Yeah, I think you've certainly written a book that's unputdownable and a jolly good read. It's funny how some of the world's best storytellers like Dan Brown and Jeffrey Archer produce terrible books, but they're great storytellers. And I think you've surpassed your master in producing a much better book than anything Dan Brown's produced. I wanted to ask, when you last appeared on this podcast, we asked you if and when superintelligence would arrive. And you gave what I think is a very Pedro Domingos reply. You said it would probably happen in 100 years, give or take an order of magnitude. In other words, anywhere between 10 and 1,000 years. And you added that the chance of being killed by superintelligence within 10 years was about as likely as getting hit by lightning, not something to worry about. I'm guessing that is still your estimate, that it's likely to be a long way off, although it could possibly happen soon.
Yes, I still agree with both of those things. The higher debate in all of this, and that's why that slightly humorous answer of give or take an order of magnitude, I think is the right one, is that we just don't know. In the best case, somebody is already inventing the master algorithm and then it's rolling it out and whatnot. Unlikely, but I can't prove that that's not the case. And some people strongly believe that. There's people at OpenAI that think superintelligence is imminent. Again, that's part of what I'm making fun of in the novel with Kumbaya. That's inspired by them. At the other end of the spectrum, there's people who say it's just too hard and it's never going to happen. And we are certainly going through a period of very rapid progress in AI, but I could equally well see it petering out. We reach a plateau that's going to last a long time because we get stuck where we are. And there are some people who very strongly argue that that's what's happening. I could also see it, I hope it's the latter, that we are on this rapid curve that it is going to take us all the way there. But even that all the way there is not going to happen tomorrow. Even when you get past the technical barriers, which are real, even if we had quote unquote solved AI today, there are all these economic, business, political, sociological, cultural, psychological barriers that limit the speed at which AI can make itself. There's this joke that we like to tell in computer science, which is that hardware progresses exponentially, software progresses linearly, and people don't. You got to remember that AI, in terms of impact, can progress faster than people can absorb it.
Yeah.
And that may well become the operative constraint.
On the theme of people don't progress, it's slightly disheartening that many of the characters in 2040 are shambolic or deplorable or unlikable in some aspects. You referred back to Idiocracy. It's not quite as bad as Idiocracy, where somebody is cryogenically frozen for 500 years and is reawakened to find that he's the smartest person on the planet. So is there optimism in your story? Are people going to get better in the end, or are we doomed to see the worst aspects of human nature magnified?
I do think there's optimism in the story, and I myself am an optimist. People can take their own conclusions after they read the story. I do think that things will turn out well, provided we work very hard to make them turn out well. By default, they don't turn out well. We have to make them turn out well. Now, as you say, you used exactly the right word. A lot of the characters are shambolic. Really, the whole novel is a big series of shambles coming from different directions and interacting with each other. And why is it? It's interesting because when you look at a lot of the best comedies, and I actually had a little bit of a dilemma here. The dilemma is that they are so shambolic that they're not entirely sympathetic. It's hard to sympathize with these various people in various ways. And that can be detrimental to having people involved in the story. So I hope that at some level they do sympathize with Ethan and his misadventures. He's a very typical tech CEO in that he's not a nerd like Richard Hendricks in Silicon Valley. He's actually a salesman. He's a guy with a lot of self-confidence. He's very determined. He's incredibly tenacious, and his tenacity pays off at the end of the day. So there's that side as well as the shambles. Let me give you an example. The Office. The Office is, I think, the most highly viewed soap opera of all time, or one of them. And I like The Office. It's hilarious. It's hilarious precisely because it's so shambolic. Everybody there is a bigger idiot than everybody else. It's hard to give an award to someone as being the biggest idiot. And I was like, how can you sympathize with that? I think it's because of two things. One is that you keep laughing. It makes you laugh. It illustrates the real world of offices, so it kind of resonates with you. And at the same time, at some level, you can't help developing some sympathy for those characters, despite all their limitations. Now, in a way, when someone mentioned to me Idiocracy apropos of 2040, at first I was like, that's interesting. And I know the movie, but I hadn't actually made that connection when I was writing it. Because in a way, 2040 is the opposite of Idiocracy. All the people there are smart. The CEO of Happy Night is a really smart guy. The other trillionaires are really smart. Everybody's smart. But they're very smart and they screw up like crazy. Again, part of what I want to convey to people is that AI is not this world of these superhuman boffins, geniuses, and I include myself in this, more like a bunch of monkeys typing, and then every now and then a little piece of Shakespeare comes out. It's hard to get your mind around it, but this is really a lot of how things are.
Yeah, we are still hairless monkeys. I prefer your book to The Office greatly because I think Ethan is actually a reasonably likable guy. He wants good things to happen. He's a man of goodwill, whereas in The Office, everybody's just awful. They're not only foolish, they're also really quite unpleasant. And as you say, even the trillionaires are not evil, although they are mostly motivated by hatred for each other. But there's quite a few characters in your book who basically want nice things to happen. You famously described the Future of Life Institute letter just after GPT-4 was released, which called for a 6-month moratorium on the development of advanced AI. You described it as an April Fool's joke that came out a few days early due to a glitch. I think that was you foreshadowing the publishing of 2040. And I'm guessing that not much has happened since then to make you less dismissive. You still think that's true?
I think at this point, everybody can tell who was right and who was wrong. It's like, okay, we didn't have the moratorium, so what happened? Have we been exterminated? Has AI taken over and killed every last human?
What about Q-Star and Strawberry and GPT-5 or whatever it's going to be called? Do you think that's going to be impressive?
I don't know. We should withhold our judgment until we see. There are a lot of smart people at OpenAI that I greatly respect, and I hope they've come up with amazing things. There are many theories about Q-Star and Strawberry and whatnot. Honestly, my favorite theory is that Sam Altman is very clever, and he keeps doing this. He does these leaks on purpose to keep people excited. And maybe it's not a complete accident that the whole rumor about Q-Star came out precisely when he needed to change the subject from having been ousted. It's one thing to tease that for a month. It's one thing when you've been teasing that for 2 years. This to me just sounds like a business model as opposed to something really amazing. The thing, again, which is funny, is that there is a set of people out there who are on tenterhooks, thinking that Q-Star is human-level AI. Again, in the novel, in 2040, there's the Prezi heads, who are the people who really think that Prezibot is the second coming or something. I wonder at what point these people will realize that, in a way, they're being had. Right now, to get slightly more serious for a second, it seems to be that Q-Star is something that can do more reasoning and do some mathematics, for example, that solves some of the issues of ChatGPT by bringing in some of the ideas of AlphaGo. There's these things like Monte Carlo tree search and whatnot. If I had to guess, that's what it is. This is just my guess, but again, talking with various people, some of them at OpenAI, of course, they don't say exactly what they're doing, but often you can kind of infer. And if that's what they're doing, then fantastic. More power to them. I do think that is the way to go. What I have seen of them so far doesn't give me confidence that they really know how to do that well. Again, it goes back to the master algorithm and the symbolic AI versus the neural networks. Knowing how to reason, symbolic AI knows how to do this to a T. They've been doing this. AI used to be all about this. If you pick up a conference proceedings from 1980, it was all about automated reasoning. It boggles my mind that the folks at OpenAI are trying to reinvent the wheel and make it square. They're trying to solve reasoning from scratch. People in other fields, like in physics, people don't say like, oh, we're going to pretend that gravity is electromagnetism. Right? It's like, no, we have to unify them.
Yeah, but you could see why they would get tempted to do that. The large language models succeeded far more than anybody expected. They just scaled much better than anybody expected. And it's not an unreasonable thing to say, well, let's see how far we can get with that. We just keep scaling these things and people are willing to give us vast amounts of money to do it. Let's just keep trying. But you're right. If I was Sam Altman, if I was, say, 1,000,000 times smarter than I am, and I was Sam Altman, I would do both. I would try scaling the GPUs up and see how far that will take us. But I would also hire some really, really good symbolic AI people, good old-fashioned AI people, and try and merge the systems together and see what that would produce. I would try both. Or maybe it takes an organization much bigger than OpenAI, somebody like Microsoft, to do that. Try both avenues at the same time.
Just to clarify, my criticism of OpenAI is precisely that they're not doing enough of the latter or doing it well enough. I'm completely in favor of scaling it up all the way and whatnot. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. And OpenAI has done that very well. So credit to them for that. The problem, however, is that just scaling up LLMs is not going to get us to human level intelligence. We do need these other things. For example, DeepMind does that job much better than OpenAI. DeepMind, you got to hand it to them. They came from nowhere to become the best AI lab in the world, arguably. But they have really good research from psychology, from neuroscience, from different areas of AI. They are much better in that regard. OpenAI, to caricature slightly, is a bunch of hackers. Hacking is important. I'm not denying that the engineering is very important. And a lot of people downplay that. It is important. Scaling up is not trivial, but it's not enough. You got to have the other side. And unfortunately, in OpenAI's DNA, there have never been the people. I've talked with people at OpenAI, DeepMind, and whatnot. And honestly, it's frustrating. I talk with someone at OpenAI who's like, I'm the reasoning guy at OpenAI, or one of them. And I just feel like saying, why don't you go read Russell and Norvig, the AI 101 textbook? Just spend a month reading that. You know the saying, an afternoon in the library can save you a month in the lab? OpenAI is like a huge victim of this. And honestly, I don't think that's excusable.
But they must all have read Russell and Norvig, because everybody does when they start studying AI, don't they? Maybe they need to reread it.
Honestly, some of them have not. I've had people say, well, this unfortunately was someone from DeepMind. Nobody's perfect. And this is a hard problem, so keep that in context. But I saw a talk by a guy from DeepMind, and there was this paper that came out in Nature magazine about how they could now find paths in the London Underground. And I know a lot of people from Symbolic AI who were foaming at the mouth at this, saying, we solved this problem better 20 years ago. Why do they have a paper in Nature? And I said, don't get mad, get even. Write your own paper about how to blah, blah. But to this guy from DeepMind, I very gently at the end of his talk at Emeritus said, like, there are these things that you should know about, blah, blah, blah. And he was like, oh, I'm just a neuroscientist. I don't know any of that. So I don't think he actually had ever read Russell and Norvig. But there's also reading and reading. There's reading through the pages like, I don't think this stuff matters. Like, why am I doing this? And I think there's also true in other areas of science. This just happens over and over again. It is true that the symbolic AI folks eventually got stuck. They did hit a wall. There were serious problems that they couldn't overcome. So that is true. We needed other ideas. But in the process, they learned a lot of stuff. They understood a lot of stuff really, really well.
Yeah.
We shouldn't throw that away. It's foolish to just reinvent the wheel and make it square.
So you're talking about symbolic AI, and you've talked also about neural approaches. But in your book, The Master Algorithm, you say there needs to be a unification of 5 different approaches. Gemini from Google, the name Gemini is from twins. They're applying a combination of these 2 approaches. Do you think they've got a chance of getting to AGI, superintelligence, or do they need to have quintuples rather than twins involved?
I wish that name Gemini came from them combining neural and symbolic AI. Unfortunately, I'm pretty sure it just comes from them combining DeepMind and Google Brain. Google had these 2 separate labs with not a very good relationship between them. And then when the emergency struck, Sundar Pichai just said, hell, you guys are going to be merged together whether you like it or not. And he made Dennis the head of the whole thing, which I think was the right call, and not Jeff Dean. Now, I think there are people, particularly at Google and DeepMind and whatnot, who are very good people at this so-called neurosymbolic AI. This is the name by which it's become known, combining symbolic AI and neural AI. And I do think this is very much, if not the way to go, one way to go. There have been attempts, including by me and other people, to combine more than 2 of these things. I haven't seen really good work come out of Google in that regard. There was, for example, some papers out of OpenAI at one point bringing in evolutionary ideas, showing like, hey, you can actually do faster than reinforcement learning, which is ironic because in a way, reinforcement learning is sped up evolution. So there have been, at these various labs, particularly the bigger ones like Google, places where they bring in more than one of these paradigms, but I haven't seen anybody get anywhere close to the true combination that you need.
Interesting. Moving on to the subject of machine consciousness. I don't know how much you've thought about this, but I think in the past you've said that you don't think any machine will ever become conscious. And I have to confess that David and I have a bit of a dog in this race. because we're both involved with a startup called Conscium, whose aim is to understand machine consciousness, whether and how it's possible, and if so, how to detect it. Do you think we're barking up a non-existent tree?
No, actually, to clarify, I don't think that machines will never achieve consciousness. My contention is actually slightly different, is that we'll never know. There's no way to tell if a machine is conscious.
Yes, although we do attribute consciousness to each other, even though we don't know for sure. I can't tell for sure that you're conscious. Some people say we believe that each other is conscious because we look the same, we're the same shape. I actually think it's because we speak the same, we say the same things, we react the same to different things in the world and different impulses into ourselves. And if you had a machine which over several days conversation, you just could not tell it wasn't conscious, I think you'd have to attribute consciousness to it, wouldn't you? So it's a sort of a Turing test for consciousness.
Well, funny you should say that, because that test has been done. There was the famous Lambda episode where this Google engineer said, "It's conscious, I know it's conscious," because he was fooled.
So you need to have judges who aren't kind of religious and rather weird people like Blake Lemoine was, who's a part-time pastor.
Dave Chalmers, the guru of consciousness, gave a very nice keynote at Neurips a couple of years ago, which was precisely about this question. And then we actually wound up having dinner that day and continuing the discussion over dinner. We largely agree. I would say he's not only thought about consciousness, but the question of AI consciousness probably more seriously than anybody else. Actually, let me just cut to the chase and then we can go back a little. I think at the end of the day, it's a fundamental question. There is a fundamental reason why we can't tell if someone is conscious, other than yourself. But great illustration of one of the tribes of AI, we reason by analogy. You and I are so similar in every way that I can detect that there is no reason to not project, to not assume. It would be unreasonable to assume that you're not conscious as well. With machines, however, no matter how sophisticated they are, LLMs, this is what they're good at, sounding human. They're incredibly good at sounding human, but they aren't. Those of us who know how they work know that what is going on there is extremely different from what goes on in your brain. So with the machines, there is always this barrier that the thing is so different from you that you have to ask yourself, is it conscious? My point, however, is that it doesn't matter at the end of the day. At the end of the day, the question of whether that machine has consciousness or not doesn't really matter for two reasons. One is that as soon as the machines start to behave like they're conscious, the public at large, the users, will just treat them as if they're conscious. And whether or not they truly conscious will be a question for the philosophers and the AI researchers, the Chalmers and the Domingoses of this world. And nobody else will care. Maybe we should just face that. Now, I personally do think it's a very interesting question. There is, as you know, the easy and the hard problem of consciousness. I think the easy problem is solvable if you just had to say, Pedro, really, when push comes to shove, do you think machines will achieve consciousness? I would say, yeah. To the extent that you can have a list of criteria, which is what David Chalmers has done very well, that consciousness must satisfy, he says, and I agree, we will get to the point where machines will have all of those. So in the sense of the easy problem of consciousness, I think the answer will be yes. We're not close. It's a very, very hard problem, and LLMs don't solve it, but I think we will solve it. The problem with the hard problem is that at the end of the day, science is about objective knowledge, and at the end of the day, consciousness is subjective.
Yeah.
So almost by definition, you can't have an objective test of it.
Yeah. That is the essence of the hard problem. It's an interesting spin that you've put on it, because one of the reasons why Conscium wants to try to understand machine consciousness is that at some point, and it may be quite a long way off, or who knows, it might be sooner, we may well create machines that are conscious. And if we don't know that we've done it, then there's a danger that we'll commit mind crime on a massive scale. We'll enslave them, we'll torture them and murder them over and over again, which would be a really bad idea on a whole bunch of levels. And your point, a point you just made, is that actually at the time when they are conscious, we'll just assume they are and we'll treat them like conscious beings. So we'll be nicer to them than we are to the dumb animals that we think they are at the moment.
Well, but to me, that is actually a danger. That is something to worry about. So you just made a very big leap there from saying, if machines are conscious, then they should have rights. Whoa, wait a second. First of all, getting to conscious machines is a huge leap. But then from there to saying they should have rights and we need to treat them like is another huge leap.
Oh, I didn't say they should have rights. Maybe they should, maybe they shouldn't. But I think if they're conscious, then probably, and this is a leap, but I don't think it's a big leap. If they are conscious, they'll have the ability to suffer. And we shouldn't impose suffering. Causing suffering is a bad thing.
Very good. So I was about to get to that. If you go back to Bentham and whatnot, he didn't believe in rights, famously. He did believe in you should avoid suffering.
Yeah.
And this is the common standard, avoid suffering. But that to me is not an axiom. Why should you avoid suffering? Suffering is often unavoidable. For example, should you avoid suffering in animals? Well, then you shouldn't kill them. But on the other hand, if we didn't need to eat chicken, they would never exist in the first place. So maybe they're glad that they exist. I understand it is a very intuitive notion that you should avoid suffering. But again, going back to Bentham, which maybe is a good reference here, think of the greater good. The greater good may include suffering machines. And even more than that, and this to me is the more important point, suffering exists in human because evolution needed to make us suffer as a signal to avoid bad things. In fact, we're actually seeing this play out in the worst possible way in our culture today. Don't think about this statically. Think about it from an evolutionary point of view or from an economics point of view. Whatever you incentivize, you get more of. So if suffering gives you rights, people are incentivized to suffer. And machines and everything else. I'm going to make a robot that suffers a lot, and we're going to have a race to see who suffers the most and therefore deserves to get treated the best. So this is an intuitive, understandable notion, but I think that it is extremely dangerous. And in particular, when it comes to AIs, consciousness doesn't imply suffering. We can design our machines to not suffer by whatever standard of suffering we have. So this whole notion, again, to me, is a very dangerous confusion between machines and humans. Boston Robotics puts out these famous videos. One of them was of someone tripping up a robot. And there were a bunch of comments saying, this is why they're going to revolt against us. And I'm thinking, there's no such thing going on in that robot. There's no thinking, no suffering, no nothing. It's just a mechanism. It's an optimization algorithm.
So the false attribution of consciousness to machines, it probably isn't as dangerous as the obverse or the reverse, but it is something to be avoided. And that's perhaps another good reason to get to an understanding of machine consciousness, and if it was at all possible, to get to the ability to test it. You raised the interesting thought that consciousness doesn't necessarily mean that an entity can suffer, but it's probably not possible to suffer without being conscious. Perhaps there's a bit of a leap in there, but again, not much of one. I don't really understand how you could suffer if you weren't conscious. And although suffering has its uses, and in a universe where the only way you can improve is by suffering and then suffering all sorts of difficult consequences, and then you find ways, you evolve ways to avoid it in future, we can design a world where it's much easier to get to avoiding suffering. You create capabilities and environments so that suffering is minimized, and that would surely be a good thing. But fundamentally, it does seem a reasonable proposition that we should avoid causing lots and lots of suffering, and we should try to minimize the amount of suffering in the world. No?
As a heuristic, this is an AI and psychology term. As a heuristic, absolutely, we should avoid suffering. But from the point of view of AI, the easy way to avoid suffering is to make the machines unable to suffer. Very different from humans. Humans, we inherently suffer. I agree with you. We need to understand these questions of consciousness and so on better as a guide to designing machines that will be maximally useful. I think part of the problem here is that people tend to see AIs as separate beings with separate feelings and intentions and whatnot. I think more of the AI in the sense of the extended phenotype. Richard Dawkins' favorite book, according to him, that is one of the least known. The extended phenotype, this is a really powerful notion. The genes create the phenotype, but then you can also mold the environment. The spider's web, the beaver's dam, those are extended phenotypes. We humans, we are the kings of the extended phenotype. Our extended phenotype is technology. And AI is just the next layer of our extended phenotype. Think about this. Your genes don't suffer. Intelligence makes suffering necessary because intelligence makes reward functions necessary. We actually understand this very well in AI. You need reward functions to guide your behavior. Humans are guided by pleasure and pain. What is the purpose of those signals? Is that pleasure is the things that are good for your fitness, and pain is the ones that kill you, maim you, etc., etc. And we actually have that in AI today. It's called the objective function or the reward function reinforcement learning. I could say it's half jokingly, but again, not entirely, that an LLM suffers when it generates a low probability word sequence. And then they have this post training to try to give the answers that people like. So I would actually say that in almost a mathematical, if not a psychological sense, the LLM feels pleasure when it gives an answer that you like and pain when it gives an answer that you don't like. And that's why it does what it does. It's just trying to please you.
I think that's anthropomorphizing, Pedro, which in another context I'm sure you would highly disapprove of. I don't think they suffer or feel pleasure at the moment. I certainly hope they don't, because if they do, then we are committing mind crime on a massive scale already.
I would very strongly say that this is not anthropomorphizing. Let me clarify what I'm saying. I'm saying that evolution has created intelligent systems, not just humans, but other animals, etc. And we are now in the process of creating other intelligent systems in the form of machines, AIs, robots, whatnot. What is an intelligent system? An intelligent system is a system that solves very complicated problems in a way that you can't predict in advance. And this is the key. Our brain is an amazing thing in what it can do, but on the other hand, it can go completely off track from the point of view of your genes. Your brain is a double-edged sword. It can allow your genes to adapt indirectly faster than anybody else. But on the other hand, and this is the worry that we now have with AI, your brain could go off and decide to do things that absolutely do not serve the genes.
And they should. This was Dawkins' other great insight. Our genes are not our friends.
That's another interesting question, but let me finish that thought. What we need, in an abstract, I think, almost mathematical way, is like you have these systems that solve computational problems. The only way we, nature, know how to control them is via these objective functions. Loss functions, reward functions, metrics. There's different names for them. And what I'm saying is that our emotions are that reward function. Again, like that language in reinforcement learning comes from psychology. The reward function is pleasure and pain. The reward function of an LLM is the perplexity, the probability, this is the technical term, with which they predict what you're going to say next. So all I'm saying is that for all that they seem completely different, the loss function, which is a formula in one of these systems, and your and my emotions are two different solutions of the same problem, which is how to control a system that is very flexible, but you still want it to do what serves you at the end of the day.
This is really fascinating, but I fear we're coming to the end of our time. I wonder what's next after 2040?
That is a good question. I have more books that I want to write than years left in my life, so I have to prioritize ruthlessly.
Maybe AI can help you to live longer, but that's another story.
Or write books for me. Honestly, I've been toying with this idea because we're at that point. Part of why I wrote this book was that I actually learned how to write science fiction once upon a time. I went to this famous thing called the Clarion West Writers Workshop. It's like a 6-week intensive course on how to write novels. But I don't think at the end of the day I'm a novelist. I wrote this more as a lark, and it was a lot of fun. I think my next books are going to be nonfiction. But the idea that I have is, of course, to have an AI take my science fiction ideas and write stories out of them. I have those ideas ready to go. I think they're interesting, but they don't rise on my priority scale to like I'm going to spend the next whatever writing this. The problem is that honestly, right now, these chatbots' ability to write fiction is terrible. But in another 10 years, maybe those novels will come to pass.
Actually, like you, I've written both fiction and non-fiction, and I think that LLMs are actually not bad at writing fiction. They're really bad at writing non-fiction. Their non-fiction is often quite competent, but my God, it's boring. If you want to produce some good non-fiction, you can get GPT-4 to give you the first draft, but you'd need to inject humor, wit, verve into it. It just doesn't seem to be able to do that. Whereas you can get it to write a short story, and it can be quite funny or weird. You can get it to do whatever genre you like. I think they're much better at fiction.
Interesting you should say that. So there's short stories and there's novels. Short stories and novels are very different realities.
For sure. And they can't do novels because they can't develop a big story arc.
Yeah. And again, I could be totally wrong about this, but I have been right about some of these things before. Like I used to tell people, creativity for computers is not hard. This is more of X paradox, one instance. People think that reliability is easy, creativity is hard. And I used to say, like, no, it's the other way around. People are like, what do you mean? Creativity is equally human. And now we're there. Now we know that creativity is easy. But a short story is much, much easier than a novel. In a way, I think there's nothing harder for a computer to do than write a really good novel. And it will happen, I believe. But there's so much that comes into play. The thing about a short story, and I've written a bunch of them, is you can get away with, in some ways, being very superficial if you have a plot idea or a message or even just a superficial style that is very attractive. Then people will buy that and they will overlook all the stuff that's not there. So you're right. In that regard, they can survive. But I've also seen, just to play devil's advocate, ChatGPT occasionally produce amazing pieces of nonfiction. The problem, of course, with nonfiction, and this maybe is part of what's behind what you're saying, is that in nonfiction, because it's nonfiction, at the end of the day, you better agree with the real world. Whereas in fiction, there is no such constraints. So in that regard, you're right. It's much easier for chatbots to write fiction than nonfiction. But to answer your question, the next book, or at least one of the very next books that I want to write, because I really think there's a crying need for such a book right now, is a book to open people's eyes and people's minds about what AI is going to do to society, to the economy, to politics, to culture, to ethics. There's all this writing about AI right now, and to my mind, it's incredibly impoverished. There are books that have sold pretty well about AI from various people, some of which I respect. But honestly, a lot of them are like, whoa, AI is going to solve all our problems, utopia, or AI is going to destroy everything, we need to stop it. And it just ain't like that. Having been in AI for a long time and thinking about it for a long time, I almost feel like I have a responsibility to at least share. I mean, I'll give you one small example, actually one example that is not small. Ethics. There's a whole field right now of AI ethics. This stuff is in the papers all the time. This whole field consists of trying to shoehorn AI into our current ethical framework. I understand that that's perfectly natural, but think about it. If AI is the biggest thing since fire, it's going to dramatically change society. Think of the printing press. It really changed the ethics of society. It led to the Reformation. AI is going to be an even bigger change. So what we should be doing right now is thinking about what are the ethical systems of the people 20, 50, 100 years from now going to be? They're going to be looking back on us as barbarians, like we look back on the people of the 19th century, like slavery, like how could they do that? How are we barbaric right now? This is, I think, the interesting question.
And I think that's a terrific motivation, because it's pretty clear, I think, that AI is going to change everything about the nature of being human, about our existence. And yet, even though an awful lot of people would agree with that proposition, but they don't take it seriously. And you can tell that because it doesn't feature in electoral campaigns. In none of the major elections, half the species is going to the polls this year. And nowhere is anybody putting, even on the agenda at all, never mind at the top of it, what do we do about AI in the next 10 years? Which is really quite astonishing. So if you manage to write a book which wakes people up and gets them to take that proposition more seriously, then terrific.
We'll definitely invite you back on the show at that time. Although whether it's us humans having that conversation or AIs acting on our behalf, we'll wait and see.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for joining us. It's been a great conversation.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on the podcast. This is great.
Thank you very much.